One missile, one compound, one catastrophic mistake. This wasn't just another strike on Tehran. This was North Korean sovereign soil. And under international law, that changes everything. Kim Jong Un is watching. His generals are calculating. And the clock is already ticking. Because when a nuclear-armed state feels violated, it doesn't send a strongly worded letter. It sends something far, far worse. Welcome to Currency Archives, where we decode the moments that reshaped the world economy before the mainstream even catches up. Now, before we go any further, if you're over 50, you've lived through the Cold War, through oil shocks, through moments the world held its breath. You know what real escalation looks like? So do us a favor, like your grandchildren ask you to save their favorite show. Hit that subscribe button. Don't let this one slip away. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? Because this story affects every single one of you. Let's get into it. The missile did not care about international law. It never does. But the men and women sitting in emergency briefing rooms across Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Seoul last night, they cared very much. Because what that missile hit was not just another building in a city already scarred by weeks of relentless strikes. What it hit was a diplomatic compound linked to North Korea, sitting in the heart of Tehran. And under the Vienna Convention, that compound is not Iranian soil. It is North Korean sovereign territory. And that single fact changed everything. For weeks, Operation Epic Fury had been framed as a targeted campaign, precise, controlled, a surgical operation designed to neutralize Iranian military infrastructure without triggering a wider regional collapse. That was the official narrative. That was what the briefing said. That was what the press conferences insisted. But precision has limits. And on the night that missile struck the North Korean diplomatic compound, every carefully constructed argument about controlled escalation collapsed in real time. The compound, according to early reports, sustained significant damage. Personnel status remained unconfirmed in the hours that followed, and the silence from Pyongyang, the specific, calculated, dangerous silence that North Korea deploys before it moves, began immediately. Within 90 minutes, emergency diplomatic cables were surging across global networks. Foreign ministries that had been managing the Iran crisis as a regional problem suddenly found themselves staring at something considerably more serious. Because this was no longer a conflict between Israel, the United States, and Iran. This was a conflict that had just touched a nuclear-armed state. To understand why this matters, truly matters, one must understand the legal architecture that governs diplomatic compounds worldwide. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, signed in 1961 and ratified by nearly every nation on Earth, is unambiguous. Diplomatic premises are inviolable. The receiving state, in this case Iran, cannot permit agents of any power to enter or damage those premises. And any strike that damages a diplomatic compound, regardless of whether it was intentional, constitutes a violation of the sovereignty of the nation that compound represents. In simple terms, the missile that hit the North Korean compound in Tehran did not strike Iranian territory. It struck North Korea, and Kim Jong Un woke up to that reality. Analysts had been warning for months that the Iran conflict carried a hidden tripwire, the deepening military relationship between Tehran and Pyongyang. North Korea had been supplying Iran with artillery shells, ballistic missile components, and technical expertise long before the first strike of Operation Epic Fury was authorized. That relationship existed in the background, acknowledged quietly by intelligence agencies, discussed in classified briefings, but never quite erupting into the public conversation with the urgency it deserved. That changed the moment the missile landed. Because now the question was no longer whether North Korea was a background factor in this conflict. The question was whether Pyongyang had just been handed the justification it needed to become a frontline participant. Inside the rooms where serious decisions get made, the debate was immediate and fierce. Was the strike on the North Korean compound a targeting failure, a catastrophic miscalculation in a densely packed urban environment where military and diplomatic infrastructure sit uncomfortably close together? Or was it something else entirely? An intelligence gap, a communication breakdown, a moment where the fog of war produced consequences that no mission planner had anticipated or authorized? The answer to that question matters enormously, because if Pyongyang concludes the strike was deliberate, even if the evidence suggests otherwise, the response will be calibrated to that conclusion. North Korea does not respond to perceived violations with diplomacy first. It responds with demonstration. And so the world waited. Emergency calls were placed. Ambassadors were summoned. Statements were drafted and redrafted. But in Pyongyang, Kim Jong Un was not issuing statements. He was receiving briefings. And the men around that table were not discussing diplomacy. They were discussing options. The conflict that began as a regional military operation had just acquired a dimension that nobody who authorized it was prepared to manage. The calculus had changed, and the clock was already running. There is a particular kind of silence that precedes North Korean action. It is not the silence of hesitation. It is not the silence of weakness. It is the silence of a government that has already made its decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to reveal it. That silence descended over Pyongyang within hours of the Tehran strike. And every analyst who has spent serious time studying North Korean strategic behavior recognized it immediately, because they had seen it before. In 2010, when North Korea shelled Yeonpyeong Island without warning. In 2017, when Pyongyang launched an intercontinental ballistic missile over Japan. In every moment where the outside world assumed Kim Jong Un would absorb a provocation quietly, and discovered too late that he never does. The strike on the North Korean diplomatic compound in Tehran was not a small provocation. It was, by every measure of international law and strategic logic, an act that touched North Korean sovereignty directly. And Kim Jong Un's decision window had officially opened. To understand what happens inside that window, one must first understand the architecture of the Iran-North Korea relationship as it existed before the missile landed. This was not a casual partnership. For years, quietly, deliberately, away from mainstream headlines, Pyongyang and Tehran had been building one of the most consequential military cooperation frameworks, operating outside Western oversight. North Korea supplied artillery shells in volumes that Iran's domestic production could not match. Ballistic missile components moved through networks that Western intelligence agencies tracked with growing alarm but limited ability to interrupt. Technical advisors, engineers, weapons specialists, systems analysts moved between the two countries with a regularity that suggested something far deeper than transactional arms dealing. What existed between North Korea and Iran by the time Operation Epic Fury was authorized was a mature strategic partnership, not a background concern. A functioning military alliance in everything but name, and now that alliance had a new dimension. Because Kim Jong Un was not simply a weapons supplier who had been caught in the crossfire of someone else's conflict. He was a head of state whose sovereign territory, legally recognized, internationally protected, had been struck by missiles fired in an operation that the United States had launched without congressional authorization and without a clear exit strategy. That combination of factors gave Pyongyang something extraordinarily powerful. It gave them legitimacy. In the court of international opinion, particularly among nations already deeply skeptical of American military unilateralism, North Korea could now frame any escalation of support for Iran not as aggression, but as self-defense, not as destabilization, but as a principled response to a violation of international law. China would not condemn it. Russia would not condemn it. And the global South, already watching Operation Epic Fury with profound unease, would find it very difficult to argue against Pyongyang's position. The statement that emerged from North Korea in the hours following the strike was brief, deliberately so. Pyongyang condemned the attack as illegal aggression and a violation of national sovereignty. Kim Jong Un, according to state media, was closely monitoring the situation and would take appropriate action at the appropriate time. 4 words carried everything: appropriate action, appropriate time. Analysts who parse North Korean state language for a living did not sleep that night. Because those 4 words, in Pyongyang's specific diplomatic vocabulary, do not mean a strongly worded letter to the United Nations. They mean that a decision has been made. They mean that the calculation is complete. They mean that the only remaining variable is timing. And timing, in this context, was everything. Because the United States military was already stretched. Patriot missile defense batteries had been depleted across multiple theaters. THAAD systems were being repositioned under conditions that left critical gaps in coverage. American naval assets in the Persian Gulf were operating under sustained pressure from Iranian drone and missile campaigns that showed no sign of slowing. Adding North Korean military escalation to that equation was not simply a complication, it was potentially a breaking point. Every serious strategic analyst understood what was at stake inside Kim Jong Un's decision window. If Pyongyang moved, if North Korea dramatically expanded its weapons transfers, deployed technical personnel directly into Iranian military operations, or made any gesture that crossed the line from supplier to participant, the conflict would enter a phase that Operation Epic Fury's architects had never modeled. A phase with no established playbook, a phase with no clear containment strategy, a phase where 2 nuclear-armed states would be in direct or indirect confrontation with the world's most powerful military simultaneously. The decision window was open, and the world was running out of time to close it. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won and lost with money. And the moment that missile struck the North Korean diplomatic compound in Tehran, the financial world began doing what it always does in moments of genuine systemic shock. It started pricing in the unthinkable. The first markets to move were the ones closest to the fire. Gulf equity indices, already operating under the sustained pressure of weeks of regional conflict, dropped sharply in early trading. But it was not the percentage decline that alarmed serious analysts. It was the speed. The kind of speed that does not reflect rational recalculation. The kind of speed that reflects something more primal, the collective recognition spreading simultaneously across trading floors from Dubai to Singapore to London, that the risk framework everyone had been working with had just become obsolete. Because the Iran conflict, until that strike, had been a contained variable. Terrible, destructive, economically disruptive, but contained. North Korea's entry, even as a potential participant, even at the level of dramatically expanded military support, removed the containment assumption entirely. And without that assumption, every financial model built on regional stability projections was suddenly, quietly worthless. The oil market told the story most clearly. Brent crude had already been elevated by weeks of strikes on Iranian infrastructure and the cascading force majeure declarations that followed. Gulf producers had been managing output disruptions with careful public messaging designed to prevent panic. Saudi Aramco, Kuwait Petroleum, Qatar Energy, each had been releasing measured statements calibrated to reassure markets that supply chains remained fundamentally intact. That messaging became significantly harder to sustain after the Tehran compound strike, because the entry of North Korean military technology into the conflict equation introduced a threat that Gulf energy infrastructure had never seriously been required to model. North Korean ballistic missile technology, the kind that Iran had been quietly receiving and reverse engineering for years, operates at ranges and with accuracy profiles that fundamentally change the calculus for any fixed energy asset in the region. Ras Tanura, the world's largest offshore oil loading facility, processing millions of barrels daily, Jubail Industrial City, the backbone of Saudi petrochemical output. The Strait of Hormuz itself, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day. Every one of these assets had been operating under a risk assessment that assumed Iranian missile capability as the primary threat vector. North Korean technology upgrades that assessment dramatically, and the oil market, slow to react to geopolitical nuance but brutally efficient at pricing existential supply risk, began moving accordingly. But energy was only the beginning, because the economic domino effect of North Korean escalation was never going to stop at oil prices. The shipping industry, already rerouting vessels away from the Persian Gulf at significant cost, faced a new and more serious calculation. Insurance underwriters who had been repricing Gulf coverage on a weekly basis now confronted a scenario where the risk models they were using had been built for a two-party conflict. They were now looking at a three-party conflict, with nuclear dimensions on two sides. Lloyd's of London market sources, speaking carefully and without attribution, described the atmosphere in underwriting rooms as something they had not experienced since the immediate aftermath of September 2001. Not panic, but a very particular kind of focused dread that precedes the repricing of everything. Container shipping rates, already elevated by Gulf rerouting, began climbing again. Supply chains that global businesses had spent 3 years rebuilding after the pandemic disruptions found themselves facing a new category of stress, one that no boardroom continuity plan had seriously anticipated. For the business community watching this unfold, the implications were not abstract. They were immediate, measurable, and in several sectors, potentially catastrophic. Emerging market economies with high energy import dependency, countries across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa faced the prospect of fuel cost increases arriving on top of inflation pressures that were already testing social stability thresholds. Foreign direct investment flows into the Middle East, which had been showing genuine resilience despite the conflict, began to pause. Not reverse, not collapse, pause. That specific, dangerous pause that precedes the larger move when serious institutional capital decides that the risk-reward calculation has shifted beyond acceptable parameters. And then there was the defense sector calculation. The United States military's air defense depletion problem, already serious before the Tehran compound strike, acquired a new and urgent dimension when North Korean escalation entered the equation. Patriot missile batteries that had been depleted defending Gulf assets against Iranian drone campaigns would now need to be reconsidered against a threat profile that included North Korean ballistic missile technology. THAAD repositioning, already creating coverage gaps across the Indo-Pacific, faced renewed pressure from an administration trying to fight a Middle Eastern war, while simultaneously maintaining deterrence posture against Pyongyang's home arsenal. The defense industrial base, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, saw immediate stock movement. Not because war is good for business in any simple sense, but because the market was pricing in a procurement emergency that would require emergency congressional authorization and emergency production timelines. The same congressional authorization that Operation Epic Fury had never bothered to obtain. Somewhere in this cascade of financial signals, of repriced risk and paused investment and surging insurance premiums, a message was being transmitted to every serious business leader paying attention. The conflict had crossed a threshold. The economic cost of what came next would not be measured in billions. It would be measured in the restructuring of entire industries, the rerouting of entire supply chains, the reassessment of entire regional strategies that corporations had spent decades building. One missile, one compound, one catastrophic miscalculation, and the dominoes were already falling. History does not wait for the unprepared. It never has. And the business leaders, entrepreneurs, and strategic decision makers who will emerge from this crisis with their enterprises intact are not the ones who are watching the headlines with passive anxiety. They are the ones who are already moving, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of cold analytical clarity that separates serious operators from everyone else, because the window for preparation is still open, but it will not stay open forever. The first thing serious decision makers must understand is that this crisis is no longer operating within a single scenario framework. Analysts at the highest levels of strategic assessment are currently modeling 3 distinct trajectories, and each one carries profoundly different implications for business strategy, portfolio positioning, and operational continuity planning. The first scenario is the contained incident. In this trajectory, back-channel diplomatic pressure, particularly from Beijing, which maintains its own complex leverage over Pyongyang, succeeds in convincing Kim Jong Un to limit his response to political condemnation. North Korea issues strong statements, perhaps suspend some diplomatic engagement with Washington, but stops short of dramatically escalating military support for Tehran. The conflict remains painful, disruptive, and economically costly, but does not acquire the additional nuclear dimension that markets are currently pricing in. This scenario is possible, but it requires Beijing to exercise influence over Pyongyang at a moment when China has its own strategic interests in allowing American overextension to continue uninterrupted. That is a significant assumption. The second scenario is proxy escalation. In this trajectory, North Korea does not enter the conflict visibly or dramatically. Instead, Pyongyang accelerates its existing weapons transfer framework with Tehran, moving more advanced missile components, more sophisticated drone technology, more technical personnel, in ways that are difficult to attribute publicly and impossible to sanction. Effectively given the existing diplomatic architecture, Iran's military capability improves materially. Gulf infrastructure faces a threat profile it was not designed to withstand. Oil supply disruptions intensify, and the United States finds itself in the position of fighting a conflict whose strategic parameters keep expanding while its authorization, its air defense capacity, and its domestic political consensus continue to erode simultaneously. This scenario is not just possible. Most serious analysts consider it the most probable near-term trajectory. The third scenario is direct confrontation. This is the scenario that nobody in any official capacity is willing to discuss publicly, but that every serious private sector risk team is quietly modeling in background. In this trajectory, a combination of continued strikes, miscalculation, and Pyongyang's escalation logic produces a moment where North Korean involvement crosses from covert support into something that cannot be managed through diplomatic ambiguity. 2 nuclear-armed states in direct or indirect confrontation. With an American military already stretched, already depleted, already operating without the congressional mandate that would give it the domestic political foundation to sustain a genuinely expanded conflict. The economic consequences of this scenario are not measurable in conventional terms. They are the kind of consequences that rewrite the global financial order. So what does a serious decision maker actually do right now? The first move is portfolio and exposure reassessment. Any business with significant revenue dependency on Gulf markets, energy price stability, or Middle Eastern supply chains needs to be running scenario analysis against all 3 trajectories, not just the optimistic one. The companies that survived previous regional crises intact were not the ones that assumed de-escalation. They were the ones that had already mapped their exposure before the market forced them to. Energy hedging strategies that made sense 3 weeks ago need to be revisited. Commodity exposure across manufacturing, logistics, and consumer goods sectors needs immediate stress testing against a Brent crude trajectory that now has genuine upside risk well beyond current levels. The second move is supply chain geographic diversification. The businesses most vulnerable in this environment are the ones that rebuilt their supply chains for efficiency rather than resilience. Lean inventory models, single-source supplier relationships, regional concentration in areas that are now directly inside the conflict's expanding blast radius. The lesson of the last several years, from pandemic disruptions to the initial Iran conflict escalation, is that geographic concentration is a liability that reveals itself only in crisis. That lesson is being taught again, right now, in real time. The third move is liquidity preservation. This is not the moment for aggressive capital deployment. It is not the moment for leveraged expansion into markets whose risk profiles are being rewritten weekly. The businesses that will be positioned to acquire distressed assets, enter repriced markets, and expand into the gaps left by less prepared competitors are the ones that are preserving liquidity now, before the full economic consequences of North Korean escalation are priced into every asset class simultaneously. Cash is not a passive position in this environment. It is a strategic weapon. And then there is the authorization problem. The issue that sits beneath every other strategic calculation like a fault line nobody wants to acknowledge publicly. Operation Epic Fury was launched without congressional authorization. It was designed without a clear exit strategy. It has now produced consequences. A struck North Korean compound, a provoked nuclear-armed state, an air defense architecture under simultaneous pressure across multiple theaters that its architects were not prepared to manage. That is not a political observation. It is a strategic fact. And the businesses, investors, and decision-makers who build their near-term strategy on the assumption that this operation will be managed competently from this point forward are making a bet that the evidence does not currently support. The single most important question every entrepreneur and business leader must answer before this escalates further is not about their portfolio. It is not about their supply chain. It is not even about their liquidity position. It is this: have they built an enterprise that can absorb genuine systemic shock? Not a recession, not a correction, not a regional disruption that resolves itself in 2 quarters. A genuine, prolonged, multi-theater conflict with nuclear dimensions on 2 sides, and no clear mechanism for de-escalation currently visible on the horizon. Because that is what the strike on the North Korean compound in Tehran has introduced into the possibility space, not as a certainty, but as a probability that serious people can no longer dismiss. One missile struck a compound in Tehran, and somewhere in the distance, in the silence that follows the kind of decision Kim Jong Un is currently making, the world is waiting to discover what comes next. The prepared will navigate it. The unprepared will be defined by it. The choice belongs to those who are still willing to make it.